There are moments in Hollywood when a single sentence, clipped from an interview and stripped of its context, can behave like an explosion in slow motion. It doesn't matter whether it was intended, misunderstood, or exaggerated in the retelling. Once the internet gets hold of it, the meaning stops belonging to the person who said it and starts belonging to everyone watching. That is exactly what happened when a resurfaced interview involving Dakota Johnson began circulating again years after the peak of the 50 Shades phenomenon. It wasn't new, and it wasn't explosive in the way headlines would later suggest. But in the modern attention economy, new is often irrelevant. What matters is timing, framing, and the emotional hunger of an audience looking for hidden meaning inside familiar stories. Within hours, fragments of her words were being replayed, re-edited, and reinterpreted across social platforms. And somewhere in the noise, the story stopped being about an interview at all. It became something larger, more emotionally charged, and far more speculative. A narrative about tension, silence, and what really happens when two actors become globally entangled in one of the most controversial film franchises of its era alongside Jamie Dornan. But to understand why this moment caught fire at all, you have to go back to the environment that created it. Not the interview, not the clip, not even the franchise itself. The pressure. Because 50 Shades of Grey was never just a film series. It was a cultural pressure cooker. Before audiences even saw a frame, the project was already carrying expectations that no romantic drama, let alone an adaptation of a divisive novel, could realistically survive intact. It was marketed globally, judged instantly, and dissected relentlessly. Every casting choice became a headline. Every promotional appearance became a performance under surveillance. And in the center of that storm stood two actors who, at the time, were still trying to understand what they had stepped into. What made it even more complex was the tone of the franchise itself. It demanded intimacy on screen, but emotional distance off screen. It required trust between performers while the world constantly projected fantasies, assumptions, and narratives onto their relationship. In that environment, silence was never neutral. It was interpreted. And interpretation, once amplified, becomes its own kind of truth. This is where the modern story begins. Not with a scandal, not with a confession, but with the way audiences, years later, began to rewatch everything. Old interviews resurfaced. Press junkets were re-uploaded in higher resolution. Behind-the-scenes clips that once felt harmless suddenly looked loaded with meaning when viewed through the lens of hindsight. A pause in speech became hesitation. A smile became discomfort. A joke became tension. And in the center of this reinterpretation loop, Dakota Johnson's public persona became a focal point. She had always been known for a certain kind of honesty in interviews. Dry humor, understated delivery, and a tendency to resist the overly polished language of Hollywood promotion. But that very authenticity became, for some viewers, a blank canvas. People began projecting emotional narratives onto her tone, her expressions, even her silences. What once looked like professionalism started to be reframed as restraint. What once looked like chemistry on set was reinterpreted as complexity behind it. And with Jamie Dornan, the same phenomenon played out in reverse. He had built a public image defined by composure, careful wording, a controlled, almost guarded approach to discussing the franchise. That restraint, intended to protect privacy and professionalism, created its own ambiguity. Because when someone refuses to elaborate, the absence of detail invites imagination to fill the space. In storytelling terms, silence is never empty. It is always occupied. As online audiences revisited their promotional appearances, a pattern began to form, not based on confirmed events, but on emotional interpretation. Clips were slowed down. Facial expressions were analyzed frame by frame. Even laughter was studied for intent. And this is where the story stops being about two individuals and starts becoming about perception itself. Because the internet doesn't just consume celebrity culture, it reconstructs it. Every fandom ecosystem eventually develops its own internal logic, and in this case, the logic became simple. If something feels slightly off, there must be a hidden explanation. If an interview feels tense, there must be an unseen moment behind it. If two actors are not fully transparent about their experience, then the truth must be somewhere beneath the surface. IT is a powerful narrative engine. And once it starts running, it rarely slows down. Years after the films had already finished their theatrical cycle, that engine was still running quietly in the background. Clips would occasionally resurface, trend briefly, then fade again. But something had shifted in the cultural climate. Audiences were now far more accustomed to decoding celebrity behavior. Every gesture could be a signal. Every sentence could be a clue. So when a particular resurfaced interview segment began circulating again, it didn't need new information to become viral. It only needed emotional context. The clip itself was unremarkable in structure, a standard retrospective conversation about career-defining roles, the challenges of intense filming schedules, and the emotional demands of long-term character immersion. But what mattered wasn't what was said. It was how audiences heard it years later. And once it entered the algorithmic bloodstream of social media, it transformed. Shortened edits removed context. Captions added implication. Comment sections filled the gaps with certainty that the original conversation never actually contained. Within this environment, Dakota Johnson's name became associated with interpretations that stretched far beyond the original material. Not because she had revealed anything new, but because audiences had changed the way they were listening. At the same time, Jamie Dornan's silence on the matter became equally significant. He did not respond to every wave of speculation. He rarely engaged with reinterpretations of old interviews. And in the absence of response, audiences once again filled the silence with meaning. This is where modern celebrity narratives become unstable. Because in earlier eras, stories required confirmation. Today, they only require repetition. A claim repeated often enough begins to feel sourced, even when it is not. A theory shared widely begins to feel validated, even without evidence. And a resurfaced clip, detached from its original context, can become the foundation for an entirely new emotional storyline. What made this situation particularly volatile was the emotional investment audiences had already made in the 50 Shades era. The franchise itself had been polarizing, heavily discussed, and culturally unavoidable. That means it didn't just exist as a set of films. It existed as a shared memory. And shared memories are easily rewritten. As the reinterpretation wave grew, entertainment commentary channels began producing breakdowns of what really happened behind the scenes, often relying more on tone analysis than factual reporting. The language used in these discussions shifted subtly from observation to assumption. Words like uncomfortable, tense, and strained began appearing more frequently, even when the source material did not explicitly support them. This is how narrative escalation works in digital spaces. It rarely begins with misinformation. It begins with emphasis. A pause becomes a sign of hesitation. A careful answer becomes avoidance. A neutral expression becomes emotional distance. And once those interpretations become standardized, they are no longer questioned. They are repeated. But beneath all of this noise, something more interesting was happening. Both Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan had long since moved forward in their careers. They were no longer defined solely by the franchise that once connected them so intensely in the public imagination. And yet, the cultural shadow of that period never fully disappeared. It lingered, ready to be reactivated whenever audiences felt nostalgic, curious, or uncertain. That lingering presence is what gave the resurfaced interview its power. Not because it revealed something new, but because it reopened something unfinished in the public mind. And once something feels unfinished, people instinctively want closure. The problem is that closure is not something the internet is designed to provide. It is designed to extend, repeat, and amplify. So as the clip continued circulating, the conversation around it became less about what was actually said and more about what people believed must have been left unsaid. And in that space between fact and interpretation, the story began to evolve into something far larger than a single interview. It became a question, not about one moment in time, but about everything that moment might represent. And that question was about to pull the entire narrative into a far more intense and emotionally charged direction, one where perception, memory, and silence would collide in ways neither actor could fully control. Because once the internet decides a story is unfinished, it does not wait for permission to continue it. And what happens next is where the speculation truly begins to take over. The moment a story becomes unfinished in the public imagination, it stops behaving like information and starts behaving like momentum. And momentum, once it builds in modern celebrity culture, doesn't ask whether it's accurate. It asks whether it is engaging enough to continue. That is exactly what happened next with the resurfaced conversation involving Dakota Johnson and the long-standing fascination around her time within the 50 Shades franchise alongside Jamie Dornan. Because once the initial wave of reinterpretation settled into social media feeds, something more aggressive replaced it: analysis culture. Every frame of old interviews began to be treated like evidence. Not evidence in a legal sense, but in a narrative sense. Something to be examined, cross-referenced, emotionally decoded. Entire threads were created breaking down eye contact patterns, vocal tone shifts, and what viewers believed were micro-reactions to certain questions. And the strange part is not that people did it. The strange part is how normal it had become. In earlier eras of celebrity journalism, ambiguity was left alone unless something concrete emerged. But in the current digital ecosystem, ambiguity is the product. The less clear something is, the more it spreads. Uncertainty is not a flaw in the story. It is the engine of it. As the discourse intensified, two opposing narratives began forming around the same material. One side viewed the resurfaced clips as evidence of emotional complexity during an extremely demanding franchise shoot, where intense working conditions, global scrutiny, and long production schedules naturally create friction between performers. In this reading, what people were seeing was not hidden conflict, but the pressure of a high-stakes creative environment being misinterpreted through hindsight. The other side saw something very different. They believed the gaps in public explanation were not accidental, but meaningful. In their interpretation, the lack of detail signaled that something significant had been intentionally left unspoken, and that silence itself was a kind of confirmation. Neither side had access to new facts, but both sides had access to amplification. And amplification is often more powerful than truth in shaping cultural perception. As commentary videos multiplied, so did the emotional framing. Phrases like "what they never told you" or "the real story behind" began circulating across platforms, each one adding a layer of implication that the original material did not contain. Over time, the narrative no longer required the original clip at all. It had become self-sustaining. This is where public figures lose control of the stories attached to them. Not through scandal, but through reinterpretation loops. For Dakota Johnson, this meant that her past interviews were no longer being watched as interviews. They were being watched as clues. Every sentence was retroactively assigned meaning based on what viewers now believed they knew. And once that shift happens, it becomes almost impossible to reverse, because any clarification is often interpreted as evasion, and any silence is interpreted as confirmation. For Jamie Dornan, the dynamic was equally complex, but inverted. His long-standing approach to privacy and restraint, once seen as professionalism, now became part of the interpretive framework itself. The less he engaged with online speculation, the more space was created for others to fill in the gaps on his behalf. This is one of the paradoxes of modern fame. Disengagement does not end a narrative. It often deepens it. As engagement peaked, mainstream media outlets began to cautiously revisit the cultural impact of the franchise itself. Not to confirm online theories, but to understand why the 50 Shades era still generated such intense discussion years later. Articles began focusing less on plot or production, and more on cultural memory, how certain films become reference points for broader conversations about intimacy, media pressure, and audience projection. Within that context, both actors were reframed not as participants in a single franchise, but as symbols of a larger cultural moment. And symbols are always easier to project onto than real people. At the same time, fan communities became increasingly fragmented. What had once been a largely unified curiosity about behind-the-scenes dynamics evolved into competing interpretive camps. One group emphasized professionalism and mutual respect, pointing to years of continued public appearances, interviews, and separate career successes as evidence that the narrative being built online was overstated. In their view, the chemistry that audiences had seen was part of the job, and the intensity of filming should not be confused with personal reality. Another group, however, focused on emotional subtext. They believed that even if nothing explicit had ever been publicly acknowledged, there were still visible signs of strain that could not be ignored. To them, the absence of clarity did not neutralize the story, it intensified it. And between these two positions, the conversation became less about facts and more about belief systems. What people wanted to believe about Dakota Johnson and Jamie Dornan often said more about the audience than the actors themselves. Because belief fills emotional gaps that information cannot. As the cycle continued, even neutral statements from older interviews were reinterpreted through the new lens. Comments that once seemed casual were reframed as guarded. Moments of humor were reframed as deflection. Even promotional enthusiasm was occasionally questioned, as if positivity itself had become suspicious in hindsight. This is how narrative gravity works. Once a central idea forms, however speculative, it begins pulling everything around it into alignment. And in this case, the central idea was simple, that there must be more to the story than what had been publicly acknowledged. No matter how many times that idea was challenged, it continued to resurface in slightly different forms. At the same time, both actors continued working, building careers that gradually expanded beyond the shadow of the franchise. But the internet does not experience time in a linear way. It operates in cycles. And every time either name resurfaced in a new project, older conversations would briefly reignite, connecting present achievements back to past speculation. This looping effect created a strange kind of dual identity, the present-day professional career and the permanently archived franchise narrative that could be reactivated at any moment. And that reactivation is what made the situation so persistent. Because unlike traditional controversies, this one did not have a single event to resolve it. There was no confirmed incident, no official statement defining a boundary, no final version of the story that everyone agreed on. Instead, there were fragments, interpretations, and years of accumulated audience imagination. That kind of narrative does not end. It only pauses. And when it resumes, it always resumes with more intensity than before. As online discussion escalated further, the emotional tone also began to shift. What had started as curiosity gradually evolved into defensiveness. People were no longer just analyzing the past, they were defending their interpretations of it. Comment sections became battlegrounds of perspective, where the same clips were used to support entirely opposite conclusions. This is one of the defining traits of modern media interpretation. The same piece of content can simultaneously serve as proof for conflicting narratives, depending entirely on